This week for our Misty Morning Sew Along, we're doing block number 7. And block number 7 is the 4 corners of our quilt. We're still working with fabric A in our background, and this is the illustration for how I'm going to explain that you put this block together. But you have options, so stay with me till the end of this because you might want to make some changes. From fabric A, your instructions say cut 1 strip 2.5 by width of fabric. So that's to cut your 12 squares that you'll need for your 4 different blocks. If you have leftover 2.5-inch strips from a previous block, you can just cut squares from there and then just from the remaining fabric cut whatever you need to get those additional squares so that you have them for your 4 corner blocks. But don't cut them yet because we might want to eliminate and make a bigger triangle in this area. But let's assume you're going to do it just the way that it's illustrated here. You're also going to need 1 strip 6.5 by 12.5. So that's a 6.5 by 12.5 inch rectangle to be able to make your half square triangles. Now you're going to need 16 half square triangles from the A fabric and background to make this block as illustrated here. You may have made those last week. If you remember, I mentioned we used this exact same fabric combination and you needed to make 32. And I said if you just go ahead and make 48, you'll have them already made for this week. So if you made 48 last week, you already have these 16 available for you. Now you're going to need that, if you haven't made them yet, you're going to need that rectangle that's 6.5 by 12.5 from your background fabric as well. Now on your sheet, it's going to say 1 strip 2.5 by the width of the fabric so that you can cut your background squares, and you'll need 8 of those. So there's 2 of them in each block. We're making 4 blocks. You may also have those already available to you by cutting up remainder from other strips. If not, cut another strip because you'll be using more squares in the final blocks of this quilt. Now this block goes on the 4 corners, and this block is one that we're going to press the seam allowances in. So when you sew these 3 together, press the seams in. For the center row, they'll be pressed out. For the bottom row, they'll be pressed in. And then when you join your rows together, press both of them in towards the center. So that way, all of our seams will be pressed in the opposite direction of the blocks next to it. So that's how you will assemble this block following this illustration. These instructions are the same instructions that you've had before that tell you how to make your half square triangles and then how to sew these together, first in rows, then sew your rows together to form the finished block. But in this case, you're going to be pressing the seams in instead of out. Now, if you look at this block and you see this area that's right here, this large triangle, as soon as I look at a block when I'm trying to decide if I would like to make it, the first thing that I like to do is eliminate as many seams as possible. So rather than sew the same fabric back together again, I would prefer to cut this as one large triangle. So in order to do that, you have to do a little quilt math. When we do quilt math, we always calculate what size pieces are using the finished size and then add the seam allowance to it. So our units are 2-inch finished. So 2 and 2 is 4. So from this edge to that edge on the triangle, it needs to measure 4 plus seam allowance, which would be 4.5, a 1/4 inch on each end. The same direction this way because it's the triangle is the same size on both sides. So we would want a 4.5 inch strip if we were cutting using a specialty ruler, like the 4590. This would cut from a 4.5 inch strip using the 4-inch line, because this ruler measures the finished size. You would be able to cut, rotate, and cut the 4 triangles that we would need for this larger area. Now some people don't like to cut from a strip or use a specialty, and some people like to oversize things so that you can trim it down later. Well, if you would like to cut this triangle from squares, you would need larger than 4.5. There's sort of a saying that's called a magic number, and people will say when you want to cut a square in half and get 2 usable triangles, then the magic number you add is 7/8 of an inch. So you would take your finished size, 2 and 2 is 4, and add 7/8 to that. So you would cut your square 4 and 7/8. Cut from point to point 1 time, and you'll have 2 usable triangles. So 2 squares would make all 4 pieces that you need. Most people also don't like to cut in eighths, so everyone rounds up. So instead of adding 7/8 of an inch, they add 1 inch. So our finished size is 4, 1 inch more would be 5. So if you cut your squares 5 inches and then cut diagonally 1 time, you'll end up with, from each square, 2 usable triangles. Now, if you like to trim off more than just a tiny bit, you might want to round up more than that, but 5 inches will be plenty in order to get this done. So, how does that going to work? Well, you won't need these 2 half-square triangles because we're replacing those, and you won't need this square because we're replacing that. So now you only need 8 of the half-square triangles, and 8 of the backgrounds, and 8 of the A fabric for the opposite corners. But now we have to make these pieces, so what we would do is fill in here, and I would take and sew a background to our A square and a background to our A square so that we have a unit that looks like this. So that unit's going to look like this when it's sewn together. And now we want to trim it, but we don't want to trim from corner to corner. We have to leave our seam allowance there. So this is how I would do that. This is my small cutting mat here, and this is my unit. My seams are pressed towards the background in this case, because remember we're pressing in on this block. And now you need to go from point to point with your seam line and cut a 1/4 inch past that. And you want to make sure that you're square. So I use my quick trim and circle ruler that has 45-degree angle lines that cross at the 1/4 inch line. So if I line this up on here like this, then the black dotted line, which is where I'm going to sew, is going to go from point to point. The 45-degree lines are lined up right here and right here, so they're on my seam lines where I sewed these 2 squares on either side. And then I can take my rotary cutter and just trim this off like that. And now I have the unit that's going to go right there. Now notice my blunt corners. Those blunt corners are because the dog ears have already been pre-trimmed. Now this is my triangle that I cut at 5 inches, and I'm going to sew that on. You can see this one is bigger than this one. So if I line this up like this, and you want this edge even, the long side even, and sew from point here to the point there. And you can see that when I have it lined up, there's very little that's going to get trimmed off. In fact, this is how much is trimmed off. So I will sew that length and then press the seam towards the larger triangle, and you'll have a unit that looks like that. A lot of people refer to that as the cat's cradle unit, and that's one that Deb Heatherly has named it that, and she has a ruler that's called a cat's cradle ruler. And so if you have that, you might want to make that. This is a finished 4-inch unit. So once you have this unit together, then you're going to sew these 2 together, and they'll be attached like this. And then you'll sew these 3 together. Remember, we're pressing our seams in, and they'll get attached like this. And your block will be complete.